But then Jake unzipped his backpack and held up the folder. "We know what you've been doing," he said, his voice steadier than Emily expected. "And now they do too." Carter's face darkened, but the damage was already done. One of the other officers took the folder, flipping through the pages. His expression shifted from confusion to something colder. "We're gonna need you to come with us," he said, his voice firm. Two more officers moved in, one pulling Carter's hands behind his back, snapping a pair of handcuffs into place. Emily exhaled, her whole body shaking with the weight of everything that had just happened. It was over. The buried secret wasn't a secret anymore. Hours later, after police statements and endless questions, Emily sat on her front porch, wrapped in a blanket. Jake was next to her, silent for a long time before finally speaking. "You really texted your mom?" Emily nodded. "I knew we might need help. Figured it was better to say something before it was too late." Jake let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "Smart move." She looked out toward the woods, the place where it had all started. The place where two bad cops had tried to hide something, and where two kids had refused to let it stay buried. Emily didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear: some secrets don't stay hidden forever. And sometimes, doing the right thing means digging a little deeper, even when it's terrifying. And he didn't look happy. He stepped toward the buried spot, his boots inches from where Emily had been digging just moments ago. His eyes swept over the disturbed dirt, and his jaw tightened. He knew. Emily clenched her fists, willing herself to stay still. Her entire body screamed at her to run, but one wrong move, and he'd see them. The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His voice was low, sharp. "Someone's been here." A pause. Then, quieter but full of tension, "No, not yet. But if they come back, I'll take care of it." Emily felt Jake stiffen beside her. She didn't know what "take care of it" meant, but she had a bad feeling they didn't want to find out. The officer scanned the woods one last time, then turned and stalked back to his car. The engine roared to life, and within seconds, he was gone. Emily let out a shaky breath. "We have to get out of here." But Jake wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on something in the dirt. "The bag," he whispered. He didn't take it. Emily's stomach twisted. The officer had come to check on it, but he hadn't dug it up. Which meant whatever was inside was still there. And for some reason, he needed it to stay hidden. Emily's hands trembled as she and Jake stared at the half-buried bag. The officer had been here, had seen that someone had found his secret, but he hadn't taken it. That meant whatever was inside was too dangerous to move, even for him. Jake swallowed hard. "We should go." But Emily shook her head. "Not yet." She dug faster now, pushing away the loose dirt until the bag was free. It was heavier than she expected, the material stiff and thick, like it had been sitting there for a long time. She hesitated, then unzipped it. Her breath caught. Inside were stacks of money, thousands, maybe more. But that wasn't what made her stomach twist. It was the folder tucked beside it, its edges worn and crumpled. Jake reached for it first, flipping it open. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Some looked like surveillance images, others were documents with names and dates. But what made Emily's skin go cold were the pictures of people, ordinary people, caught in moments they probably never realized were being watched. Some of the photos had red X across them. Jake's face was pale. "This is bad," he muttered. "Really bad." Emily didn't need him to explain. Whoever these people were, the cops had been keeping tabs on them for a reason. And some of them weren't around anymore. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps pounded through the trees. Fast, coming straight for them. Jake stuffed a folder into his backpack. "Run." Emily didn't hesitate. She turned and sprinted, her heart slamming against her ribs. Behind them, a voice shouted, a deep, angry roar. The officer. He had come back. Branches scratched against Emily's arms as she and Jake weaved through the trees, desperate to reach the edge of the woods. The sound of footsteps closed in. Closer. Closer. Then, blinding blue and red lights flashed ahead. Sirens. More cops. But these weren't the ones from last night. These weren't the bad ones. Jake skidded to a stop, breathing hard. How? Emily's hands clenched around the bag. I texted my mom, she whispered. Told her something was wrong. Before Jake could respond, the officer chasing them burst through the trees, only to be met with the stunned faces of his own fellow officers. And just like that, his secret was no longer buried. For a moment, everything was still. The officer, the one who had chased them through the woods, stood frozen under the flashing red and blue lights. His jaw tightened, his eyes darting between Emily, Jake, and the other officers who had arrived. He knew it was over. One of the uniformed cops stepped forward, hand resting near his holster. "Detective Carter," he said slowly, "mind telling us what you're doing out here?" The officer, Carter, lifted his hands slightly, like he was weighing his options. Emily's chest tightened. Would he lie, try to cover it up? At breakfast, she'd barely touched her cereal. Her mom noticed. "You okay, sweetheart?" Emily hesitated, the words sitting on the edge of her tongue. She could tell her mom everything. The cops, the bag, the way they acted so guilty. But something inside her stopped her. What if she was overreacting? What if they really hadn't done anything wrong? If she told the wrong person, and those cops found out, would she be in danger? "I'm fine," she mumbled, stirring her spoon around the bowl. Her mom gave her a curious look but didn't push. At school, Emily struggled to focus. The teachers taught, but their voices blurred together in the background. The only thing she could think about was that patch of dirt in the woods. By lunchtime, she had made up her mind. She needed to go back. She needed to see what was inside that bag. She waited until school let out, then ran home, grabbed a small garden shovel from the garage, and stuffed it into her backpack. Her stomach knotted with nerves as she slipped into the woods, following the same path as the night before. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the bushes made her jump, but she forced herself to keep going. When she reached the spot, she hesitated. The dirt looked undisturbed, but Emily knew better. Taking a deep breath, she knelt down and started to dig. The earth was softer than she expected, and after a few minutes, the tip of her shovel hit something solid. A chill ran through her as she wiped away the dirt, revealing the edge of the black bag. Her hands shook as she reached for it, but before she could pull it free, a twig snapped behind her. Emily spun around, heart hammering. Someone was watching. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She scanned the trees, her pulse pounding in her ears. The woods was silent now, too silent. Someone was there, watching, waiting. She didn't move, didn't even breathe. Maybe if she stayed completely still, whoever was out there wouldn't notice her. But then, from the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of movement, a dark figure shifting between the trees. Panic gripped her chest. Had the cops come back? Had they realized someone had been here? Emily's hands clenched around the shovel, her fingers slit with sweat. She wanted to run, but her legs refused to move. Then a voice, low, careful. "What are you doing?" Emily whirled around, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest. Standing just a few feet away was Jake, the boy from her neighborhood. He was of age, maybe a little older, always riding his bike around, always getting into trouble. She exhaled sharply, relief flooding her. "Jake, what are you doing here?" He crossed his arms. "I could ask you the same thing." His eyes flickered to the half-buried bag. "What's that?" Emily hesitated. She barely knew Jake, but something about the way he looked at the bag told her he already had a guess. "I saw something last night," she admitted. "Two cops. They'd buried this here." Jake's face darkened. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You serious?" She nodded. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he crouched beside her, brushing dirt off the bag. His fingers trembled slightly. "We shouldn't be doing this," he muttered. Emily swallowed hard. "I have to know what's inside." Jake glanced around the woods, his expression tense. If this is what I think it is, we're in trouble. Emily met his eyes, fear twisting in her gut. What do you mean? Before he could answer, the distant sound of tires crunching against gravel cut through the trees. A car, coming fast. Emily's stomach dropped. Whoever it was, they were coming straight for them. Emily's heart pounded as the sound of the approaching car grew louder. She and Jake locked eyes, both frozen in place. They had to move now. Cover it back up, Jake hissed, grabbing a handful of dirt and tossing it over the bag. Emily scrambled to help, their hands moving fast, but the rumbling engine was too close now. The car skidded to a stop just beyond the trees. A door creaked open. Heavy footsteps crunched over the forest floor. Emily barely had time to dive behind a nearby bush, dragging Jake down with her. They crouched low, hands pressed over their mouths, barely daring to breathe. Through the gaps in the leaves, Emily could see him, the taller of the two officers from last night. His uniform was gone, replaced with dark jeans and a jacket, but she recognized his face. The night was darker than usual, the kind of darkness that made everything feel just a little more secret, a little more dangerous. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the dry leaves on the forest floor. But it wasn't the wind that had drawn little Emily out of bed that night. It was the sound of car doors slamming shut, deep in the woods behind her house. She wasn't supposed to be out this late, not alone, and definitely not hiding behind a tree, spying on strangers. But something about the way the two men moved, the way they kept glancing over their shoulders, made her stomach twist with unease. She could barely see their faces under the glow of their flashlights, but she caught a glimpse of something shiny on their belts. Badges. Cops. Emily should have felt safe knowing they were officers, but she didn't. Not when they were digging a hole in the middle of the woods, not when one of them dropped a heavy-looking black bag into it. The other one quickly shoveled dirt on top, his movements rushed, almost frantic. They weren't just burying something. They were trying to make sure no one ever found it. Her heart pounded as she crouched lower behind the tree, afraid they might hear her quick, shaky breaths. She wanted to run back home, to pretend she hadn't seen anything, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, watching as the officers exchanged a few hushed words, glanced around one last time, then hurried back to their car. Within moments, the only thing left was the faint sound of their tires crunching against gravel as they sped away. Emily swallowed hard. She knew she should forget about this, pretend it never happened. But she couldn't, because whatever was inside that bag, whatever those cops were trying so hard to hide, was something they didn't want anyone to find. And now, Emily was the only one who knew their secret. Emily stayed hidden for a long time, listening to the silence settle back over the woods. The air felt heavy, like it was holding onto a secret too big to keep. She should have turned back then, run straight home and climbed into bed, but her curiosity wouldn't let her. Her fingers curled into the rough bark of the tree as she stared at the patch of freshly disturbed dirt. What had they buried, and why? Emily's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. She had always thought of police officers as the good guys, the ones who were supposed to protect people. But tonight, she had seen something that didn't make sense. If they were doing the right thing, why had they been so nervous? Why had they kept looking over their shoulders like they were afraid someone was watching? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. What if they had seen her? What if they came back? She forced herself to step back, one foot sliding carefully over the leaves, trying not to make a sound. But then, snap, a twig cracked beneath her shoe. Her breath hitched. She froze, waiting, listening. But there was nothing. No voices, no movement, no headlights cutting through the trees. The officers were gone. Still, she didn't dare stay any longer. She turned and ran, her feet barely touching the ground, as she darted through the trees, back toward the warm glow of her house in the distance. She didn't slow down until she was climbing back through her bedroom window, heart pounding so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. Lying in bed, She stared at the ceiling, her mind spinning. Should she tell someone? Her parents? No, they wouldn't believe her. Adults never did. Maybe she should just forget about it. But she knew she wouldn't. Because whatever those officers had buried out there, it wasn't meant to be found. And somehow, that made Emily want to find out the truth even more. The next morning, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something she was never meant to. Every time she closed her eyes, she pictured the two officers standing in the moonlit clearing, shoveling dirt as if their lives depended on it. The memory clung to her like a shadow, refusing to let go.